Tonight, you're not scrolling for an answer. You're sitting on a low seawall at Somerton, watching dusk pretend it's just another ordinary evening, while the world does that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a man arrive already finished, pose like rest and surrounded by polite little objects that don't know their evidence. You will follow a battered book that reappears with its last page wounded, its middle missing, and a soft pencil code that refuses to be a key. And you'll see how one torn line 2 words, neat as a signature, can pull an entire city into decades of whispering. 3 small senses to hold on to: surf breathing against stone, salt cool air in your nose, and that thin amber of streetlights sliding over sand. Something nearby keeps time tram bell, then the click of a matchbox lit slow and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe the tram bell will remember you there, thinning into the dark at the exact second you start to drift. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a chase, or a gun, or a dramatic confession. It begins with a pocket that stayed quiet, and a sentence torn clean from a book to mom shut an ending that introduces itself before the story even starts. You might not expect this small scrap of paper to become the loudest thing in a quiet coat pocket, but it does. Not loud in the way of sirens or scandal or anything with sharp edges. Loud in the way a single pebble in a shoe is loud, even when you're trying to be dignified. The surf breathes against a low wall. A tram bell thins into dusk. A matchbox closes like a verdict, but only the gentle kind of verdict, the kind that simply says, yes, this is an object, and now it is shut, and that is all. On Somerton Beach, in December of 1948, a man is found sitting as if he has simply chosen to rest. Not sprawled, not dramatic, just arranged. His shoes look like they remember being polished. His suit looks like it was asked to be presentable in a debate. The sand has not climbed into his cuffs in any enthusiastic way. It's as if the beach itself has decided to be polite. The man's head is angled, his legs are out, and the posture suggests someone who has sat down to watch the sea and then stopped being interested in anything. People, being people, lean toward details because details feel safer than meanings. A suit can be described, a pocket can be emptied. A body, even when it is unresponsive, becomes a list of belongings and observations. A doctor can write what he can write, and what he can't write stays silent in the margins. There is, in the simplest sense, a human being there. And then, very quickly, there are objects, tickets, a comb. The sort of small, practical items that travel with you like quiet pets. Sometimes there are cigarettes. Sometimes a matchbox, altered in that very human way where you modify a thing you already own instead of buying a new one, because that is how most lives are actually run. The clothing is tidy enough to look intentional. The knot of a tie is neat in the way someone's handwriting is neat when they have been trained to keep their lines straight. But then you begin noticing what isn't there. No wallet, no identification that behaves like identification. Tags and labels that should have been inside the clothes are missing, carefully cut away like someone snipped off the name from a gift. It's a small act, but it has the feeling of someone taking time. It isn't the kind of absent-minded missing that happens when you lose your keys. It is the kind of missing that happens when you deliberately remove the part that tells people a story about you. The pockets are quiet, if a pocket can be quiet. They hold only what they must, and that, in its own sleepy way, is part of why this becomes famous. The case doesn't begin with a shouted confession. It begins with the soft refusal of ordinary labels. It is a bus ticket or a train ticket, the kind that says you were somewhere and going somewhere else, like receipts say you once bought milk. There is a comb, which suggests hair and mornings, and the mild human optimism that grooming always hints at. There is a matchbox, which is basically a portable promise that you can make fire on demand as long as the world cooperates. The first official notes are not poetic. They are practical. Height, build, clothing. Small marks, small scars, the way time signs a body in tiny handwriting. There is no struggle noted in the sand, no overturned drama. The man does not explain himself. He declines in the most complete way possible. And in a world that loves explanations, the quietness becomes its own activity. Everyone begins doing the work of meaning on his behalf, like librarians trying to shelve a book that has no title on the spine. Breathe in 4, out 6. Let the numbers arrive and leave. In 2, 3, 4. Out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is something soothing about counting, and there is also something very official about it. It feels like paperwork for the lungs, and the Somerton case becomes paperwork for a whole city, a file that doesn't stop being opened. Then comes the scrap. Not at first, because life enjoys being late with its important details, but eventually, in a pocket, or tucked in a place that had not been properly thanked for holding secrets, there is a small rolled piece of paper. It is not a long letter. It is not a rant. It is not even trying very hard. It is simply a few printed words, tamam shud, 2 words quietly foreign to most English-speaking mouths, and therefore immediately fascinating because they make the tongue slow down. They mean something like, "it is finished," the kind of phrase that usually appears at the end of something, not in the beginning of an investigation. The phrase is Persian, and it is famously printed at the end of certain editions of a book of poetry, the Ribayat of Omar Khayyam. Poetry, in this case, behaves like a seed. You put a tiny phrase in a pocket, and suddenly you have a whole garden of speculation sprouting under glass. The scrap looks as if it has been torn cleanly from a page. Torn, but with intention, not shredded, not crushed. Just removed. The police put it under glass because glass is what we do when we want an object to feel important and also to stop anyone from touching it. Glass turns paper into an exhibit. The city, meanwhile, puts it under tongue the way you worry a sore tooth. People repeat the words. People mispronounce them. People pronounce them with confidence anyway, because confidence is another form of clothing. And the odd thing is that the scrap is both dramatic and boring at the same time. Dramatic because it is a message that refuses context. Boring because it is so small. 2 words. Not a code with fireworks. Just the quietest possible ending, wandering around without its beginning. It is the historical equivalent of finding the last page of someone else's grocery list. Eggs, it is finished, and then everyone holds a meeting. When you have a scrap, you want the rest of the paper. When you have a phrase from a book, you want the book. And in this case, the book turns up as if it has been waiting politely in a car, like a guest who arrived early and sat down without making a fuss. A battered copy of the Rubaiyat appears, and it has been harmed in exactly the right place. A page torn from the end. The tear is not just similar. It fits. Paper edges meet each other like bones that have decided to be polite and align. This is the moment where, if this were a loud story, someone would slam a desk. But we are not slamming anything. We are sitting at a desk with a lamp that makes a small circle of light. We are turning pages slowly. The book is not a glamorous object. It is a little worn. It has lived in pockets and glove compartments. It has been held by hands that may or may not have washed the dishes first. And the important feature is not the poetry itself, but the back cover where pencil marks wait like shy insects. On the inside of the back cover, there are lines of letters. Groups, not full sentences. Not a neat little paragraph that says, "Hello, I am a mystery." Just clusters that look like the remains of someone trying to remember something. Like a person scribbling a phone password and then promising themselves they will delete it later. The marks are fate. They are private. Pencil is always private because pencil can be erased, and erasing is basically the physical form of regret. Also, there is a phone number, just there, not dramatic, not explained. A number sits near the code like a doorbell no one wants to own. A number is, in its own sleepy way, the most modern thing in the entire case. A number says if you call, a human might answer. And that feels like progress, even though it is also just another kind of waiting. Now you have the book. You have the torn page. You have the code. You have the number. This sounds like a lot, but it is actually still small. A pocket scrap. A thin book. Some pencil scratches. It's almost cute how little material a mystery requires to take up hundreds of hours of human attention. It is the world's least efficient hobby, and yet people keep doing it because the brain hates an empty bracket. Experts, amateurs, hobbyists, and anyone with a pencil and a confident frown begin to circle the letters. They suggest ciphers. They suggest abbreviations. They suggest acrostics, which are basically poems that pretend to be shy. They suggest that maybe the spacing matters because sometimes the spacing does matter, and sometimes people just ran out of room. Someone says it might be a root cipher, which sounds like a very exciting way to say reading order. Someone else says it looks like initials. Someone else says it looks like the kind of thing you de-write when you're retired and you don't want anyone to see what you mean, including yourself. And there is, at some point, the gentle shadow of official interest. Security services are often pulled into stories like this, partly because it's the era, and partly because humans love upgrading a confusing puzzle into a significant puzzle as quickly as possible. A quiet death becomes a case. A pencil note becomes a code. A man becomes the Somerton Man, which is a name that simultaneously gives him an identity and removes one. It is possible, of course, that the pencil letters mean something private and small. It is possible they are a reminder list. It is possible they are the first letters of words someone was trying to memorize, like a student writing study prompts. It is possible the code is not a code at all, but the leftovers of human thinking. And that possibility is almost too boring for people to accept, which is funny because we are here specifically to enjoy the boring. If you want something mildly absurd, consider how many hours of analysis can be built on the decision to write in pencil instead of ink. Ink would have been firm. Pencil is shy. Pencil can smudge. Pencil can be erased by a thumb. Pencil is what you use when you are not sure. And then a whole world of very sure people come along afterward and announce what it must mean. Breathe in 4, out 6. Let your mind do what minds do. It will lean forward toward meaning, and then you can gently guide it back to detail. The letters are grouped. The letters repeat. There is an X, perhaps, which could mean a kiss or a crossroads, or simply a mark used to count. There are lines through lines. There are odd spaces. The sort of thing that makes a person squint, and squinting is surprisingly tiring, which is helpful if you are trying to fall asleep. The phone number, meanwhile, does what phone numbers do. It connects a case to another human being with a voice and a living room and probably a kettle. The call is made. A nurse answers, or someone who has been described as a nurse, living not far from the beach area. The conversation is, by all accounts, not cinematic. It is awkward, in that way calls from police often are, because the police are calling about something you didn't order. She says she knew the book, or she had once given a similar book away, or she recognizes something, and then she recognizes not enough. It's a strange kind of recognition, the kind where a name might be familiar, but you cannot attach it to a face, because time has already loosened the knots. She has a life to continue. She has a morning to get through. She closes a window in her mind and returns to her routine, which is what most people do when confronted with a mystery. Most mysteries do not pay rent. Witnesses, as witnesses do, offer descriptions that are both helpful and not. A man seen walking. A man seen sitting. A man who looked like many men. This is another mildly boring fact about history. Most people look like other people, especially in certain decades, with certain haircuts and certain suits and certain ways of carrying shoulders. He looked ordinary is a sentence that sounds harmless until you realize how much it blocks. And record keeping keeps going. Called, visited, denied. Verbs remain. Nouns thin out where privacy begins. The file grows heavier. Pages are added. Each new idea becomes a note, not a conclusion. Each new test is filed. Each new opinion is logged politely beside the last. There is a kind of bureaucracy to uncertainty. It is not a dramatic fog. It is a neatly labeled fog, stored in folders. Then elsewhere, at a station, a suitcase becomes part of the story like a sleepwalking extra who wanders onto the stage and sits down. In Adelaide, a case had been left in a cloakroom. Not with a big sign, not with a confession. Just left, the way people leave luggage when they are planning to come back. It has its own small, ordinary objects. Clothing, tools, thread, things that suggest travel and work, and the humble maintenance of a life. And in that suitcase, too, there are signs of labels removed. Text cut out, a recurring gesture, like a person who compulsively tears off the corner of every receipt. There may be a shaving kit or items that imply shaving, which is another oddly intimate detail. The case includes the evidence of a face that was once daily attended to. There are small tools, possibly for marking, for stenciling, for fixing. The kind of practical items that make you imagine someone being competent in a quiet way, like a person who repairs buttons without announcing it. The suitcase doesn't solve anything. It simply adds more objects to describe. Clerks write inventory lines straight as rails. Someone notes orange thread, and that becomes a detail, which is the smallest unit of fascination. There are laundry marks, the kind that used to be used so clothes could survive communal washing without being confused with other clothes. Marks that are not quite names, but they're not quite nothing either. The marks are like whispers that have been laundered too many times. If you are listening to all this and thinking, this is extremely slow for a mystery, you are correct. But that is actually how most real investigations are. They are mostly paper. Mostly looking, mostly trying, and then writing down that the trying did not conclude anything. Television has betrayed us by removing the waiting. History, on the other hand, insists on it. History says, please sit down, here is your file, here is your pencil. Your reward is ambiguity. Over the years, the case does what cold cases often do. It changes physical form without changing its emotional temperature. It moves from active handling to archived handling. It becomes something you can request, something you can cite, something a journalist can summarize in a way that makes it sound like the story is moving. But in the background, the city learns to live with a question the way you live with a creaky stair in an old house. You stop being startled by it. You just step over it. Inquest notes cool into folders. Photographs age into that particular grayscale that makes everything look more official than it felt at the time. The code changes hands. People redraw it, reinterpret it, write articles, start clubs, join forums, mail each other diagrams of arrows. Each new attempt adds a margin note and leaves the main text alone. There's something almost soothing about that. A mystery that refuses to be dramatic is, in its way, granting everyone permission to simply continue. And because the world keeps moving, new tools arrive. Forensic methods improve. Databases grow. People begin to think in terms of DNA and genealogy and probability, which are like modern prayer forms. You feed information into something larger than you and hope it returns a name. There are proposals to exhume, to test, to compare. These are not cinematic moves. They are administrative moves. Forms are signed. Permissions discussed. People argue politely about what is respectful and what is useful, which is a very human way to circle the same question for decades. Meanwhile, the poem book remains a poem book. The phrase remains 2 words. The scrap remains small enough to hide beneath a fingernail. And the sea at Somerton remains loud enough to erase footprints by morning. The most consistent character in the whole story is the tide. It does its job without commentary. It smooths. It erases. It returns. Some mysteries close with a bang because the world likes a bang. This one closes, if it closes at all, like a library book you keep finding open on the table. You don't remember opening it. Someone else might have. Or perhaps you did and you simply forgot because you were sleepy and the lamp was warm and the pages were thin. That is the tone of the Somerton man. Thin pages, faint pencil, a soft refusal to be pinned down. So for your bedtime oath, keep facts in one jar and interpretations in another. Keep the scrap in one jar small, rolled, stubborn. Keep the book in another battered, ordinary, strangely famous for being damaged. Keep the code in another letters that sit still and refuse to become a key. Keep the suitcase in another thread, scissors, quiet tools, and the ache of missing labels. And if your mind knocks on the door of meaning too loudly, ask it for receipts. Ask it gently. Ask it the way you ask a friend to lower their voice in a quiet room. Add 1 small check tomorrow, if you want. Erase 1 flourish tonight. Let the tide wash rumor off the stones, not because rumor is evil, but because it is loud. Let the tram bell fade into the kind of distance that doesn't need to be measured. Let the matchbox close again and again with that tiny click that says, yes, the object is still here, and now it is shut, and that is all. And if the scrap whispers its last line again, it is finished. You don't have to argue with it. You can simply breathe in 4 and out 6, and let the ending be small and quiet, and let yourself be too. You might not expect a candle to be treated like a piece of paperwork, but for long stretches of history, it was. Wax was a schedule you could light. A wick was an appointment that slowly kept itself. Somewhere in a quiet stone room, a small flame rehearses patience, and the air learns to move carefully around it, as if drafts are rude. If your room is still, let it stay that way. And softly, just as the flame does, notice where you are and what time it is, and how your breathing sounds when nobody is grating it. Whisper very gently, where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer out loud. The question can just sit beside you like a closed book, present but not demanding. And if you still awake by the time we reach the problem of monks arguing with wind, you can subscribe. Or don't, no pressure. The candle will not take attendance, and neither will I, in places where the day was measured by prayer and habit monasteries, churches, households that liked routine more than excitement. Time was not always a neat circle on a wall. Sometimes it was a thing you had to make. You had to choose your materials. Beeswax, if you could afford it, because beeswax burns cleaner and smells faintly like someone is trying very hard to be wholesome. Tallow, if you couldn't, because tallow is practical and makes no promises about elegance. One is the kind of light that feels like a library. The other is the kind that feels like a kitchen that has seen a lot of honest work and a few suspicious sausages. Wicks mattered in a way that is almost comically serious. Too thick, and the flame behaves like it has opinions. Too thin, and it sulks. The twist of the fibers, the dryness, the way the wick stands or bends, these details were the difference between we are on schedule and we are improvising spirituality. Imagine trying to keep your day organized with a tool that can be offended by humidity. It's like having a calendar that refuses to load when the room is slightly damp, which, to be fair, is most old buildings most of the time. Before anyone even lights the candle, there are whole small rituals of preparation. Melting, pouring, dipping, smoothing. In some workshops and households, candles were dipped again and again, building layers slowly, like a patient lie. In others, molds made them more uniform, which is what humans do when they are tired of surprises. Even the simplest candle carries evidence of a supply chain: bees, livestock, butchers, chandlers, market stalls, and the mild frustration of someone trying to get wax off their hands without also erasing their fingerprints from history. Then comes the part where a candle stops being a candle and starts being a device. Marks are added. Not fancy marks, just plain little measurements lines, scratched or notched. Sometimes metal pins pressed in at intervals so that as the candle burns down, time is seen disappearing in predictable bites. It is strangely calming. A flame eats the future slowly. It gives you a visible excuse to do one thing at a time. There is also quietly a boundary here. Candles are vulnerable. They need protection from wind, from curious fingers, from the kind of cat that believes all objects exist for personal research. So a candle clock tends to live in a sheltered place, a niche, a lantern, a draft-free corner that feels a bit like a tiny stage. People stand back as if respect will improve accuracy. Someone might say a prayer. Someone might simply look serious because seriousness is another way of making things feel reliable. Breathe in 4, out 6, in 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear time agreeing to be counted, not because it wants to, but because you ask politely. Once the candle is lit, the entire world becomes suspiciously physical. Time is no longer an abstract concept. It is wax softening, it is a wick shortening, it is a faint smell. It is a small pool of melted material gathering like a quiet meeting at the base of a flame. And if you want an unnecessary detail, which I always do, the speed of burning depends on so many things that it becomes almost funny to call it a clock. Wax composition, wick thickness, room temperature, airflow, altitude, and the general emotional state of the building, which is not real science, but it feels real when you've lived in an old house. Some candle clocks attributed in certain traditions to important people who liked being on schedule were meant to burn a known amount in a known time, so that prayers, guard shifts, and household tasks could be nudged into regularity. There is something adorable about it. Modern people set alarms on phones that sync with satellites. Medieval and early modern people sometimes set alarms by sticking little pins in wax so they would drop at roughly the right time and land on a metal plate with a small, sleepy clink. It's the same desire, honestly. Please, future me, don't forget. And then naturally, the candle refuses to be perfect. A draft enters like an unwanted opinion, and the flame leans sideways, burning unevenly, making your carefully measured hours look slightly embarrassed. The wick mushrooms, the wax tunnels. One side melts faster, and suddenly your hour becomes more of a suggestion. This is the part where timekeeping becomes less like mathematics and more like personality management. You are not measuring an objective universe. You are negotiating with combustion. People responded with gentle engineering, lanterns, glass covers, strategic placement near walls. A kind of domestic feng shui for flames. Some places used multiple candles to compare, which is both cautious and faintly insulting to each individual candle, as if saying, I trust you, but I also trust your colleague. And if you're picturing a sleepy monk squinting at two flames like a disappointed supervisor, yes, that is an image worth keeping. It has the right mixture of devotion and mild annoyance. Micro hooks, softly useless, candle makers were sometimes regulated, because humans regulate anything that can be sold, taxed, or complained about. There were expectations about weight, quality, ingredients, especially when institutions depended on predictable burning. Imagine filing a complaint that your candle is too fast. Imagine inspectors sniffing wax like a wine critic. Then writing with great dignity, "This smells like someone cut corners." It's hard not to admire the commitment to bureaucracy, even while you're drifting off. In monastic life, time had an emotional importance precisely because it was meant to be calm. The point wasn't urgency. The point was rhythm, prayer at set times, work at set times, meals that arrive without drama, sleep that arrives like a curtain lowering, not like a door being slammed. A candle clock fit this world because it was quiet. A bell is loud, and a bell requires someone to pull it. A candle just continues. It's the least needy timekeeper imaginable until it isn't. Clerks and rule writers, those gentle architects of routine, could be surprisingly specific about light. How many candles should be used, where they should be placed, how to avoid waste, which was both spiritual and financial. In winter, when days were short and darkness felt like it started early out of spite, candles were precious. Not just because wax cost money, but because light cost work. Bees, animals, labor, transport, every minute of flame was a little economic event. So you get rules. Keep the candle away from drafts. Trim the wick. Don't borrow the good beeswax for your personal reading corner. Don't leave candles burning unattended, because fire will happily continue your schedule in directions you did not request. And sometimes you get records notes about how much wax was used, who was responsible, and how the institution was, once again, trying to keep itself tidy. Meanwhile, outside monasteries, households also made quiet use of burning time. Not always as a clock, but as a measured habit, a candle that lasts through a certain task, a bedtime routine, a watch. In some cities, regulations about curfews and night watches were paired with practical signals bells. Lamps, patrols, and candles were the portable version of "we are being responsible." A small flame in a lantern says, "I am here, I am awake, I am not trying anything exciting." It's the historical equivalent of wearing a reflective vest. Of course, because candles are divas, people kept backups. Water clocks in some places where dripping could be trusted more than burning, though water also has moods. Sand glasses, especially for shorter intervals, because sand is politely predictable as long as it stays dry. Bells, because bells are loud and therefore persuasive. And sometimes the simplest method of all. The stars, the darkness. The feeling in your bones that it must be late because your mind is getting soft around the edges. And yet candle time persists precisely because it is so gentle. A candle does not demand. It does not beep. It does not flash. It simply becomes shorter, which is a very patient way of reminding you that you are also becoming shorter technically, but we don't need to dwell on that. The candle is an agreement between matter and duration, and it keeps its side of the bargain until a draft arrives and ruins the metaphor. Over the centuries, more accurate clocks appear because humans cannot leave well enough alone. Springs, gears, pendulums, devices that are louder in their presence, more assertive. They tick and they insist. In comparison, a candle feels like a quiet old friend who never brags about being correct. Candle clocks become less necessary, but the idea of measured light stays. People still time things by how long a lamp lasts, how long a candle burns in a window, how far the wax sinks. Even now, you can feel it in language. Burning the midnight oil, keeping light on, watching time melt away. And in archives and museums and footnotes, candle clocks remain charming because they are almost too humble to be real technology. They seem like the kind of thing you would invent if you were half asleep and trying to solve a problem without waking anyone up, which, honestly, is how a lot of history works. Someone somewhere wanted order. Someone somewhere had wax. The rest is just gentle persistence. So here's the bedtime oath for this kind of history, the kind that measures life in small, patient losses. Keep facts in one jar and comfort in another. Put beeswax in one jar and tallow in another. and label them in your mind without judging either one. Put the wick in its own jar, because it does most of the work and gets very little credit. Put the little pin alarm in another jar, because it is absurd and practical at the same time, like most human inventions. And put the draft in another jar too, because the draft will always show up and pretend it wasn't invited. If your thoughts knock too loudly, ask them for receipts. If the day feels long, remember that a candle does not rush, and still it changes. Add one small check tomorrow, trim one wick, straighten one habit, soften one sharp corner of worry. And for now, let the room stay still. Let the flame, imagined or real, do its quiet downward work. Let time be measured in something gentle, something warm, something that doesn't demand a conclusion, just a soft fading, as if the schedule could continue without you noticing, and that would be perfectly fine. You might not expect a single scrap of paper to become a kind of long-lived household object, the way a spare button does, or a key you never throw away because it might open something. But sometimes history keeps one small thing and then refuses politely, stubbornly, to say what it's for. If your room is quiet, let it keep being quiet. Let the quiet do its job. And just for a soft moment, think about labels and pockets, and the way a city can hold its breath over something as small as a folded line of text. Whisper, if you like, where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. The question can just sit there like a ticket stub in a drawer, not important, not urgent, just present. Now imagine a beach at the edge of a city where the shoreline is doing its slow work and everything feels slightly accounted for by nature. Waves count and then uncount. Footprints appear and then are politely erased. And into that ordinary, repetitive rhythm, an ordinary-looking man is found sitting as if resting, dressed as if he made careful choices and then stopped making choices entirely. There's a calmness to the way the scene is often described, too calm, in a way that makes people suspicious because human beings prefer mysteries to be dramatic and cooperative. But the beach refuses to perform. The sand just stays sand. The man's shoes stay polished, like they were prepared for something boring, like commuting. If you've ever emptied your pockets at the end of a day and been mildly surprised by your own life 2 receipts, a coin you can't remember earning, a ticket, a wrapper you absolutely did not enjoy, then you understand why investigators look at pockets like they read tiny autobiographies. Here, pockets are almost rude in their neatness. A bus ticket, a comb. Things that suggest a routine. Things that say, I belong in a week where errands happen. And then, awkwardly, they stop talking. Because pockets can list objects, but they can't list motives. A comb can't testify. A ticket can only prove that a bus existed and that someone at some point believed in the future enough to plan a short ride. Then there are the labels, or rather, the absence of them. Labels cut out of clothing is the kind of detail that makes the human brain sit up straighter, like it's been offered a puzzle instead of bedtime. But we are trying to stay sleepy here, so let's treat it like laundry, because honestly, it is also laundry. Someone removed identifying marks, or the clothes were altered, or the clothes were secondhand, or someone simply hated labels the way some people hate the little plastic tag on a mattress. History rarely gives you one clean reason. It gives you a basket of plausible reasons and asks you to pick one without making eye contact. A doctor's note, an inquest file, a few lines on paper. These are the tools that official life uses when it wants to describe the undescribable without getting emotional about it. No name, no clear explanation that can be stamped and filed. Just a body that declined to be a neat story. And if you think that feels unsatisfying, yes. That is the emotion most paperwork is designed to prevent. And it fails here, gently, because humans can't help wanting an answer. Then, quietly, A small extra detail arrives, like a loose thread you notice only when the room is very still. A scrap of paper, tucked away, rolled, carried in a pocket the way you might carry a reminder. It's so small it feels almost personal, which is exactly why it becomes public. People don't like mysteries that fit in the palm of a hand. They want them to be larger, so they can blame the weather. The words on the scrap, tamam shad, have a calm finality to them. They're Persian for "it is finished," a kind of phrase that sounds like a closing door. But here it behaves less like an ending and more like a beginning, because the moment you say finished, a crowd immediately asks, "Finish what?" Police put it under glass. The city puts it under its tongue. Newspapers repeat it until it becomes a small spell. And the most ordinary thing about this scrap is that it is, essentially, a torn piece of a book paper that used to sit quietly among other paper, doing the boring job of being read. Breathe in 4, out 6, in 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. An ending can be just an ending, but sometimes for humans, an ending is merely a handle. Eventually, a book does appear, as if it had been waiting for someone to ask nicely. A battered copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which sounds romantic, but also sounds like the kind of book that ends up in odd places because it is popular enough to travel and old enough to look mysterious. The important detail is the last page. It's missing. It's wounded in exactly the place where a small scrap might have come from. Paper meets paper like two awkward relatives at a family gathering. They fit and everyone stares. And then the book turns from literature into something closer to a notice board. In the back cover, faint pencil marks. Lines of letters, grouped in ways that look deliberate but not obviously meaningful. It's almost like homework that no one wants to claim. The sort of writing you do when you're waiting at a stop, at a counter, in a life, and you want your hand to stay busy so your thoughts don't wander into loud territory. Of course, once letters appear, the world fills with people who love letters too much. Codebreakers, hobbyists, serious officials. People with rulers and people with instincts. People who think every sequence is a message, and people who think every message is a sequence. The pencil marks are studied for patterns. Are they an acrostic, like the first letters of lines in a poem? Are they a root cipher, like directions folded into text? Are they initials of words, names, places, quiet appointments? The letters sit there, refusing to be a key, like a door that politely pretends it has never heard of you. There are pauses in the analysis that feel almost domestic. Someone copying the letters onto fresh paper. Someone checking spacing as if spacing has feelings. Someone debating whether an X is an X or a cross out or a kiss, or simply the kind of mark people make when they done to want to write the whole thing. This is the sleepy heart of investigation, not the chase. Not the confrontation, just people at tables, leaning over paper, being politely haunted by handwriting. And then there's a phone number. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind, the kind that rings and changes your life. More like the kind that sits in your pocket and becomes a nuisance. A number written down is an invitation to a conversation and also an invitation to awkwardness. Because calling a number is admitting you don't know something, and humans dislike admitting that even in daylight, let alone in a case that has attracted attention. A nurse's phone rings in a quiet street. This detail is always described with a certain carefulness. She says little, remembers less, closes the window. And if you've ever had your ordinary life brushed by someone else's strange story, you know why someone might do that. Not out of guilt or drama, but out of a tired preference for privacy. Privacy is sometimes just the desire to be left out of other people's curiosity. The record keeps verbs called, visited, denied, and the nouns get blurry, because nouns are where identities live. Verbs are safer. Verbs can happen without naming anyone. Witnesses recall a man who looked like many men. This sounds like a non-detail, but it matters in the most boring way. In a crowd, anonymity is easy. The man carried himself like someone who could blend, and the case collects those soft, unsatisfying statements. He might have been, he looked like, I think I saw. They're the verbal equivalent of fog on glass. You can draw a shape in it, but it won't last when the room warms. Then, as if the story wants to become a catalog, a suitcase appears at a station. A case that waited. A case that belonged, supposedly, to someone. It sits like abandoned luggage sits, patient, mildly accusatory, pretending it has done nothing wrong. Inside, shirts, underwear, orange thread, tools, stencils, objects that suggest travel and work, but refuse to suggest a name. Like a costume box without an actor. The labels and the clothing have the same problem as before. Altered, removed, inconsistent. It's as if identity has been treated like a detachable accessory, like a hat you can leave behind. Tailor's marks point everywhere and nowhere. Scissors have already made their decisions, and clerks do what clerks do. They write inventory lines straight as rails. The tracks go foggy just past the platform. That's the whole mood, really. Straight lines that lead into a blur. If you want a small modern analogy, make it a quiet one. This is like inheriting someone's old phone with the contacts deleted. You can scroll through blank spaces. You can guess from the apps. You can notice fingerprints of routine. But the person is missing and the device will not confess. Over time, the city learns to live with the question the way you live with a slightly crooked picture frame you stop noticing. Inquest notes cool into folders. A stone takes a borrowed name and keeps it without complaint. The book changes owners. The code changes hands. Each new telling adds a margin note, sometimes helpful, sometimes just enthusiastic, and leaves the main text alone because the main text is stubborn. Some mysteries close with a bang. This one closes again and again, like a book you keep finding open. And there's a strange gentleness in that, if you let it be gentle, because the case becomes less a hunt and more a habit of attention. A city practicing curiosity without resolution. People practicing restraint sometimes, and sometimes not. But the core objects remain small. A scrap, a book, a pencil, a suitcase. It's all very unglamorous. It's the kind of history that could fit in a drawer, and yet it stretches across decades. Because the human mind likes unfinished patterns the way a tongue likes a sore tooth, it returns without meaning to. So here's a bedtime oath for unfinished files, offered in the softest voice with no urgency at all. Keep facts in one jar, scrap, book, code, case, and keep stories in another jar labeled lightly, open rarely. Add one check tomorrow, if you must, and erase one flourish tonight, if you can. Let the tide wash rumor off the stones. If meaning knocks, ask for receipts, but don't get up too fast. And if silence answers, let it. Let the surf keep breathing against the low wall. Let the tram bell thin into dusk. Let the matchbox shut like a verdict that nobody reads. Let the last line be repeated only because it's small enough to hold and quiet enough to sleep beside. You might not expect the size of a loaf of bread to change without anyone calling it a scandal, but in a medieval town, it could shrink with perfect legality, like a polite magic trick performed by grain prices. One day you hold a loaf that feels sturdy and reassuring, and the next day you hold a loaf that feels like it has been thinking anxious thoughts overnight. And nobody panics. They simply bring out the scales. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be quiet. Let your mind do that gentle thing where it listens without needing to solve anything. Whisper if you feel like it. Where and what time are you listening from? You don't have to answer. The question can sit beside you like a folded receipt you'll never throw away. Now, picture a small town market, early enough that the stones still feel cool, and the stalls are mostly wood and habit. Bread is everywhere in a way that is almost boring, which is exactly why it becomes important. When something is daily, it becomes political without any effort. You can be very brave about a dragon, but you will become extremely serious about breakfast. The baker is not performing heroism. The baker is performing repetition. Flour, water, salt, leaven, heat, time. The same idea over and over until it looks like nourishment. And because everyone is eating the same idea, everyone wants to know what it should weigh today. Not what it should cost exactly, because medieval life enjoys doing the opposite of what you expect. There were places and times where the price of a basic loaf might be held steady and the weight changes instead. It is like deciding your subscription fee will never change, but the company will quietly remove a feature every week. You still pay the same coin, you still receive bread, but the bread becomes philosophically thinner. So the market has a quiet set of tools for this. Scales, weights, a table of numbers, sometimes literally a table, sometimes a memory, sometimes a pinned notice that looks like it was written by someone who truly loves columns. Grain is measured because grain is a kind of weather you can store. Bad harvests make the loaf smaller. Good harvests let the loaf relax into its proper bulk again. It is all very calm on the surface. It is math pretending to be morality. There's a soft, almost cozy absurdity to the way officials might treat flour like a national mood ring. If wheat is expensive, the loaf is smaller. If wheat is cheap, the loaf is larger. The customer still hands over the same coin and receives a loaf that is technically fair, because fair has been translated into ounces, not feelings. Everyone acts as if the scales are a neutral god that never gets tired, never has favorites, and never secretly wants a nap in the back room. If you're still awake by the time the town starts discussing the correct weight of a farthing loaf, you can subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. The bread will continue whether you watch or not. Bread is extremely confident that way. In some places, this whole system had a name that sounds grand for something so edible, and a size, a set rule, a formal understanding between hunger and government. It doesn't need to shout, it just needs to show up on time. Someone somewhere decides that a penny loaf should be this weight when wheat is this price. Someone copies it. Someone pins it up. Someone else sighs because the ink has smudged. And the smudge number might mean the difference between acceptable loaf and mild civic disappointment. And now the town develops jobs that are frankly perfect for bedtime listening. Imagine being the person whose responsibility is not to conquer anything, but to verify bread. To stand there quietly like a human bookmark in the page called acceptable loaf weights. To receive a loaf, place it on a scale, and make a face that says, this is either fine or not fine, while trying not to look too theatrical about it. In a world where entertainment is limited, even a neutral face can feel like a performance. The baker, meanwhile, has their own quiet problems. Flour isn't always consistent. Ovens are moods with doors. Wood burns at whatever pace it pleases. A loaf can come out slightly too light simply because it had a dramatic childhood in the oven, getting too much heat too fast, expanding, then settling into itself like a person who has overpromised, and it's hard to feel angry at a loaf. It's just doing loaf things. Still, the system insists on pretending that bread can be perfectly regulated. There are fines. There are confiscations. In the gentlest version, there's a simple correction. Make it heavier next time. In the less gentle version, there are public shamas that are technically about fairness, but also about making an example out of someone who failed at carbohydrates. Even that, though, becomes routine. Routine is what drains drama out of everything. A punishment repeated too often becomes a municipal ritual, like sweeping. And while bread is being weighed, there is often another item in the town's sleepy moral universe, ale. Because if bread is the daily solid, ale is the daily liquid. Water can be suspicious in medieval cities. Ale is boiled, fermented, socially acceptable, and sometimes safer, which is a funny sentence if you say it slowly. So towns regulate ale as well, and that leads to another gentle job, the ale taster. An ale taster is not a glamorous figure. They are at best a civic palate. There are stories sometimes repeated a little too eagerly about ale tasters sitting on benches spilled with ale to see if their trousers stick, which is the kind of detail people love because it is mildly silly and faintly uncomfortable, like a joke that doesn't fully wake you up. Whether or not every town actually did exactly that, the general idea is true. People found ways to check quality and honesty, and they did it with the tools available, which were mostly human senses and a willingness to be mildly inconvenienced. So the market becomes a soft orchestra of checks. Loaves weighed, ale tasted, measures inspected. Someone comparing a cup to a standard cup, as if cups have feelings and might lie under pressure. Someone inspecting a weight to see if it is truly a pound, or if it is secretly a pound that has been on a diet. And behind this, always, is the table of prices. The grain price is a kind of heartbeat. If it changes, everything changes, but in a pre-agreed way. It's a medieval version of those calm charts that explain interest rates, except instead of mortgages, you get loaves. If you've ever seen a modern grocery store scale that insists your grapes are exactly 0.74 pounds and therefore worth exactly this amount, you can feel the echo. The difference is that medieval life often fixes the coin and changes the weight, as if the coin is sacred and the loaf is negotiable. It can get wonderfully specific. A farthing loaf, a halfpenny loaf, different names and grades of bread, from the fancier white breads to the darker, more ordinary ones. Sometimes you have wastel or manchet in the conversation, which sound like characters in a sleepy play, but they are just breads with different flours, different whiteness, different social meanings. Whiteness, of course, becomes an unspoken form of status. The whiter the bread, the more sifted the flour, the more labor in the process, the more it becomes less about hunger and more about signal. Even in a world that is mostly mud and chores, people still find ways to say, I am doing slightly better than yesterday, and sometimes they do it with bread. Now drift with me away from the stall and toward the place where these things become official. A room with paper, a clerk, a ledger, a seal. This is where boredom becomes power. This is where the town keeps its memory in ink, because human memory is unreliable and also tends to gossip. The clerk's day is the kind of day that rarely makes it into songs, which is why it is perfect for sleep. The clerk writes down the grain price. The clerk copies the assize table or consults it. The clerk notes fines. The clerk records names, or the lack of names, or the best guess at a name, someone mumbled while trying to leave quickly. It is less investigation and more accounting with a moral theme. There are seals, 2 wax pressed with a mark, because the medieval world loves proving that a piece of paper is not just paper. A seal is like a little pledge. This document belongs to the town's authority, and not to your cousin who owns a pen. The wax cools. The stamp sits there, very serious. It is a tiny red or brown blob, pretending to be the boundary between order and chaos. And in the simplest, sleepest way, this is what law often looks like. Not swords, not trials with speeches. Just a small fine written down because someone's loaf was light and the town doesn't want to argue about it every morning forever. A fine is a way of saying, we have noticed and we are tired. It's surprisingly modern, actually. Sometimes there are inspections that feel like early versions of customer review culture. The baker is watched. The measures are checked. The baker might be expected to mark their bread in a particular way, so the loaf can be traced back to its maker, like a very edible signature. The town is always balancing 2 desires. The desire to let people do business and the desire to prevent people from quietly cheating with fractions. And it's worth noticing how sleepy and repetitive cheating can be. It's not always dramatic. Often it is just shaving off a bit, a little less weight, a slightly smaller measure, the kind of dishonesty that doesn't announce itself because it wants to be confused with ordinary variation. And the town, in return, develops ordinary systems to catch it. Systems that don't require excitement. Systems that require patience and scales and the willingness to compare one loaf to a rule. If you think this all sounds like a lot of effort for bread, you're right. But bread is never just bread when it feeds a whole place. It becomes a public mood. And public moods are always regulated, one way or another. Now let the scene shift gently, as if someone closes a ledger and opens a door. The market quiets later in the day. The scales are put away, the benches wiped. The clerk's ink dries. People go home with their loaves, and a loaf simply becomes a loaf again, not an object of governance. In the home, bread loses its numbers. It becomes slices, crumbs, crust. It becomes something you eat while thinking about other things. That's the strange relief of it. The town can regulate the loaf's weight at the stall, but once it crosses the threshold into a kitchen, it becomes private again. It becomes part of ordinary life, the kind that doesn't get stamped. And in ordinary life, people develop their own quiet measurements. They know which baker tends to be generous. They know when the bread feels too airy, like it's been persuaded into looking larger than it really is. They know which loaves go stale too fast. They know which breads taste like someone tried, and which taste like someone is exhausted. None of this goes into the ledger. It goes into habit. It goes into the soft internal database every person carries. Over decades, these systems change. Rules are modified. Tables are updated. Sometimes towns get stricter, sometimes looser, sometimes simply more bureaucratic, which is a different kind of strictness. But the underlying idea stays sleepy and persistent. If you can standardize a loaf, you can standardize a little bit of peace, not perfect peace. Just the peace of not arguing every morning about whether you've been cheated by half an ounce. And perhaps the strangest part is how gentle the whole thing can feel from a distance. We imagine medieval life as loud and dirty and dramatic. And yes, it could be. But it was also full of people trying very quietly to keep daily life from turning into a constant dispute. A chart on a wall, a scale on a table, a clerk writing the same kinds of lines again and again, a baker counting coins and counting loaves and counting the ways the oven might surprise them. So when you think of law, you can also think of bread. The law is sometimes just a loaf placed on a scale and a person saying, close enough, or not quite, without raising their voice. Now, if you want to keep facts in jars, like we've been doing, you can put the numbers in one jar and the feelings in another. In the first jar, grain prices, loaf weights, assize tables, measures, seals. In the second jar, the quiet relief of eating, the mild annoyance of a small loaf, the sleepy gratitude of not having to argue about it today. You don't have to open either jar right now. You can just know they exist. And when you're ready to drift, let the market fade in your mind the way a sound fades when you walk away from it. Let the scales rest. Let the clerk put the pen down. Let the baker's hands finally stop touching flour for a moment. Let the town be a town, not a problem to solve. Tomorrow the grain price will be whatever it is, and the loaves will adjust in their calm, mathematical way, and someone will weigh them and someone will sigh, and most people will simply eat. Keep one small check tomorrow, if you need it. One small thought. Somewhere someone once treated a loaf like a legal argument and did it with a straight face. And tonight, let one rumor go about drama, about mystery, about needing an ending. Bread does not need an ending. It just needs the next morning and the next simple eating and the next quiet, steady breath in and out, and the gentle feeling that the world can be regulated, at least a little, by something as boring as a scale. It's strange, in a very quiet way, how a mystery can hinge on something as sleepy as a phone number written in pencil. Not a confession, not a dramatic note, just a few digits. The sort of thing you de-scribble on the back of a receipt and then forget in a coat pocket until the coat becomes a different coat. And yet, in Adelaide in the late 1940s, a number like that could feel oddly heavy because numbers were not yet floating around in your mind all day. You had to look them up. You had to keep them. You had to treat them like small, private objects. A phone number then often lived in a directory that was thick enough to count as furniture. Pages thin, print dense, names lined up like disciplined little soldiers. You didn't search a name. You hunted it with your fingertip and a faint sense of resignation. Exchanges had their own logic, two little systems of letters and local habits, the kind of orderly arrangements that make modern people nostalgic for problems they never had. A single wrong digit didn't mean try again. It meant you might accidentally ring a bakery, or a patient aunt, or someone who answers with a cautious hello. That carries the gentle weight of not knowing who you are. So when a number appears quietly in the back of a book, or remembered by someone who would rather not remember too loudly, it becomes less like a clue and more like a doorbell you didn't really want to press. Someone writes it down. Someone checks it twice. Someone hesitates because calling feels too direct, too awake, like turning on a bright light in a dim room. But eventually, the call happens. A ring in a quiet street. A receiver lifted. A voice that says little, because saying little is sometimes the safest way to exist inside a town-sized question. And the thing about a number is that it drags a whole everyday world behind it. If the number belongs to a nurse, then it also belongs to shift work, to tired feet, to neat handwriting on charts, to the calm ritual of washing hands. If the number belongs to an address, it belongs to doors that stick in humid weather, to curtains that move with invisible breezes, to neighbors who know the sound of your footsteps on the path. A number is never just a number. It's a label pinned onto ordinary life. Breathe in 4, out 6, and let the ordinary parts stay ordinary. Let the pencil marks be just pencil marks for a moment. Let the idea of a phone call soften into the simple image of someone turning a dial, finger in a hole, rotating time in a circle, and letting it click back into place. No urgency. No grand reveal. Just the slow, slightly awkward mechanics of reaching a person, the way a town reaches itself carefully, politely, with the faint hope that whoever answers will make the situation feel normal again. You might not think a city's sleep could be measured in lost umbrellas, but it almost can. Each one is a tiny weather report about a day that turned out differently than expected. Someone left home under a gray sky, took the umbrella just in case, and then, somewhere between getting on a tram and getting off again, decided the sky looked friendly enough to walk away without it. The umbrella stayed behind, folded neatly, like a shy guest who didn't know when to leave. By the time anyone noticed, it had already begun its new career as paperwork. In the quiet world of lost property, everything starts with a surface. A wooden counter, a metal tray, the top of a filing cabinet that has seen more pockets emptied than some people's whole lives. You can imagine a clerk, a little bored, smoothing their hand across that surface between waves of commuters. A hat, a scarf, a bus pass, and then another umbrella. They are oddly easy to forget. They stand politely in corners and lean against seats without protesting. They are, in a way, the introverts of personal belongings. If you are still awake by the time we reach the cupboard that holds nothing but mismatched gloves, you are very welcome to subscribe or follow or whatever people do now. But honestly, if you drift off before that, the gloves will understand. In the 19th century, when railways were new and exciting and full of soot, Lost property offices began to spread almost accidentally. At first, station masters tried informal methods. A box by the ticket window, a note pinned near the timetable. Umbrella black. Owner may claim. The trouble, as they soon discovered, was that black umbrellas breed in descriptions. Nearly every umbrella was black. The handles were wooden. The fabric was good. The owners arrived and pointed hopefully at each one, as if affection alone might make the right umbrella step forward. So the railways did what railways always do when faced with human confusion. They made a system. Each umbrella became a line in a ledger with its own date, train number, and approximate personality. Umbrella, black, medium length, brass tip, handle slightly chewed. Sometimes it was the clerk who chewed the handle while thinking. Sometimes it was a dog. Sometimes no one knew, and the description became a riddle. The ledgers were written in tidy columns, with ink that faded slowly as decades passed, until the words themselves looked a little waterlogged, like the umbrellas they described. In those offices, the air smelled of wet cloth and carbon paper. On a rainy day, umbrellas arrived faster than they could be registered. They leaned against walls and desks, and sometimes each other, forming nervous little forests. A clerk would move through them with a pencil behind one ear, tapping each handle in turn, counting under their breath. 1, 2, 3 with a silver band, 4 with a cracked ferrule, 5 that probably used to belong to someone who cared about it once. Outside, people hurried past in the same rain, clutching their own umbrellas tightly, unaware that they were essentially auditioning for the collection. The rules were simple and slow. A lost umbrella waited. It waited for 3 months or 6, depending on the railway company and how optimistic they were about human memory. During that time, it could be claimed by anyone who could describe it convincingly. It squeaks when it opens, someone might say. The third rib from the left is bent, or less helpfully, I've had it for years. Clerks learned to ask patient questions, the way a calm teacher might coax a child through long division. Did it have a strap? A button? Was there a name on it? Owners almost never put their names on umbrellas. They put their names on luggage, on trunks, even on their walking sticks. But umbrellas seemed temporary, as though the relationship might end at any shower. Meanwhile, out at the platforms, the same story repeated day after day. A brisk morning, a drizzle. An umbrella opens with a soft pop, like a modest firework. By lunchtime, the sky clears. The umbrella sits under a seat, smugly folded. The owner leaves in a better mood, thinking more about lunch than about precipitation. Hours later, a cleaner finds the umbrella and performs the small ceremony of bringing it to the office. The umbrella, which has seen the inside of trains and streets and perhaps a pub, sees instead a row of others just like it and realizes, if umbrellas can realize anything, that it has joined a very slow parade. Every now and then, something mildly surprising happens in the quietest possible way. A ticket inspector hands over an umbrella covered in painted flowers, clearly not factory made. A child's name is lettered in uneven ink along the handle. The clerk writes this down very carefully, because children's possessions are treated with an extra layer of hope. People will move mountains to retrieve a beloved toy. They will, sometimes, even read the fine print on a claim form. The umbrella waits in a special corner, where the clerks put things they secretly want to see claimed. Sometimes, weeks later, a tired parent arrives with that, "Please let this be here," look that every lost property worker knows. Sometimes the flowers go home. Sometimes they don't. Either way, the ledger gets another line. Over decades, lost property offices started to keep statistics. They counted umbrellas by the 100, and then by the 1,000, and then, in some cities, by the tens of thousands per year. Imagine shelves, floor to ceiling, filled with nothing but folded canvas and curved handles. Some were already unfashionable when they were lost. By the time the office gave up on their owners, they looked like minor historical exhibits. You could trace changes in design this way, quietly, through accumulation. Solid walking stick models with metal points slowly gave way to lighter frames with plastic tips. Patterns appeared: plaids, stripes, even cartoon characters. Every style represented a moment when someone thought, yes, this one is mine. This one expresses my relationship with the weather. After the official waiting period, the unclaimed umbrellas needed to go somewhere else. No one wanted to throw them away. It felt rude, as if the owners might suddenly remember them and appear dripping and indignant at the counter. So railway companies and city authorities invented another tradition that blended commerce and tidiness: the lost property auction. On appointed days, the doors opened, and buyers came in to inspect tables piled high with items whose main crime was being forgettable. Umbrellas were bundled into lots. 6 umbrellas, assorted. People bid on them the way one might bid on potatoes, by weight, by number, not by story. Somewhere, a clerk who had written their descriptions months ago watched them go and felt the ledger entries gently unhook themselves from any hope of a reunion. Every now and then, however, an umbrella refused to be ordinary. Perhaps it had an ivory handle carved into a lion's head. Perhaps the shaft concealed a small glass flask in case of emergencies that required both dryness and brandy. These curiosities earned a line in the office gossip. "Did you see the one with the sword blade?" Someone might whisper during tea break, even though it was probably just a long, sharp-looking rib. Rumors grew more exciting with each retelling, as rumors enjoy doing, but at the end of the day, the umbrella still ended up in a lot number, under a hammer, in a new hallway. The brandy flask might be discovered years later by a puzzled grandchild. The lion's head might eventually stare at a different ceiling. The humble umbrella also suffered from mistaken identity in the wild. Because so many looked alike, especially when hung on office stands and restaurant racks, people often walked away with the wrong one. They discovered it only later, in the rain, when the umbrella behaved suspiciously, opening too easily or not at all, or smelling faintly of someone else's cologne. These mix-ups created a secondary ecosystem of semi-lost umbrellas, not lost enough to report, not familiar enough to love. Some of them eventually wandered into lost property anyway, found in taxis or libraries or on the backseat of a bus after the last passenger stepped off with empty hands. In some cities, a certain pride developed around the efficiency of the lost property system. Officials boasted that a high percentage of items were returned to their owners. Posters appeared, gently scolding citizens to put their names on things. The posters were read, nodded at, and promptly ignored, especially where umbrellas were concerned. People seemed to feel that an umbrella still belonged more to the weather than to them. It was borrowed from the sky, and if the sky wanted it back via the medium of a tram seat or a cafe corner, that was just how things worked. As technology crept in, the atmosphere of lost property shifted from paper to pixels, but the umbrellas stayed the same. Computer systems replaced ledgers. Clerks typed descriptions into fields instead of ruling columns by hand. Color, navy, pattern, polka dots, distinctive features, fraying tie, label made in. Unreadable. Some offices went so far as to take photographs. Somewhere on a server, there are thousands of almost identical images of umbrellas, each slightly awkwardly posed like shy models at a very dull fashion shoot. The search features became faster. It was easier than ever to look up an object. What did not change was the basic requirement that someone remember they had lost it in the first place. Now and then, you might imagine an umbrella that has traveled through several such systems over half a century. Born as polished wood and crisp fabric in a shop window. Purchased with vague good intentions, left on a tram. Logged in a ledger by a clerk with nice handwriting. Sold at a railway auction in a bundle of 6. Used for a while by a teacher who preferred to get wet rather than carry things, and so lost it again. Logged in a computer database this time. Sold online in another anonymous lot. Eventually, it ends its days leaning against a back door, ribs bent, used more as a reminder to buy a new umbrella than as a practical tool. At every stage, it has been carefully noted, numbered, and then quietly abandoned. On rainy nights in cities with long histories of public transport, you can stand on a platform and feel this whole layer of absent-mindedness underneath the usual bustle. People shake water from their hair. Lights reflect in the puddles. Train doors hiss open and closed. Somewhere inside each train is a row of metal bars or hooks or stands where umbrellas have been forgotten for over a century. The styles have changed, the fares have changed, the announcements have become more electronic, but the habit has not. Humans remain spectacularly consistent in their preference for focusing on where they are going over what they are carrying. If your mind is still wandering quietly with us, you can picture the modern lost property clerk sitting at a desk, lit by the soft glow of a computer screen, surrounded by shelves of objects that other people used to think were important. There's probably a mug nearby. There may be a little radio playing. The clerk takes in another umbrella from a security guard or a bus driver, gives it an entry in the system, and finds it a spot on the rack. The sound it makes when the handle settles between its neighbors is a small, almost inaudible click. Another line in another invisible history. Behind the labels and the lot numbers, there is a slow, almost comforting lesson about human nature. We are very good at holding onto what really matters most of the time. Keys, children, wallets. Even then, not always, but often enough, umbrellas fall just below that threshold. They are important enough to buy again, but not important enough to haunt us. When they disappear, our memory gives a little shrug and moves on to dinner plans. Lost property offices, therefore, become museums of things our minds decided not to keep. If you listen closely to that idea, it makes the whole system feel oddly gentle. No villains, no crimes, no dramatic music. Just small acts of forgetting, tidied into order by patient people with labels and shelves. Somewhere, a stack of forms explains exactly how long an umbrella will be kept before it is declared unclaimed. Somewhere else, a policy document advises on how to handle items of sentimental value, as if sentiment can be measured in days. The umbrellas sit perfectly still through all of this, neither protesting nor volunteering any information. You can fall asleep here in this office without anyone minding. Picture the murmur of distant traffic, the ticking of a clock that no longer officially matters because the computer shows the time, but stays on the wall out of habit. The faint scent of dust and old rain. Rows of umbrellas standing like quiet delegates at a very long, very polite conference where nothing is ever voted on. Outside, another shower begins, and 100 people reach automatically for their own umbrellas, some well-loved, some already halfway to being forgotten. When you next see a stray umbrella propped against a doorway or left on a bus seat, it might feel, just for a second, like you are meeting a character in this slow, ongoing story. You can choose to pick it up and hand it to someone, or carry it to a counter, or simply leave it there trusting the invisible machinery of lost property to do what it has always done. Give the umbrella a number, give it a little time, and then gently let it go. The world of sleepers and commuters and clerks will continue at its unhurried pace, and somewhere in the background, another line will be added to a list. Another handle will slide into place on a rack, and the rain will keep teaching people how easy it is to forget something you were sure you would keep. You might not expect a small strip of paper barely worth the space it takes up to keep a whole city politely awake for decades, but it did. Not loudly awake. Not newspaper headline awake. More like the way your mind stays half on when you misplace a receipt, and you keep remembering it at the wrong times. A scrap in a pocket, a page missing from a book, a neat suit that refused to come with a neat explanation. and the strangely gentle fact that everyone involved, from clerks to detectives to curious strangers, mostly spent their time doing the slowest work imaginable, writing things down, checking them twice, and then putting them back in folders. It begins, as many quiet mysteries do, with someone sitting as if they simply chose to rest. Somerton Beach, early summer air, the kind that feels clean in a way that makes you notice your own breathing. A man is there, shoes polished, posture arranged in a way that might pass for comfortable if you didn't look too long. And naturally, people did look too long, not out of drama, out of that ordinary human habit of noticing when something is slightly out of place, like a chair turned the wrong way in a waiting room, or an umbrella in the corner that isn't yours. A few hours later, the out-of-place feeling becomes a formal matter. A doctor writes what he can write. A police officer does what police officers always do in these situations: measures, notes, labels, counts. The beach doesn't argue. The tide doesn't offer an opinion. The man doesn't either. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe quietly, if possible, but please don't strain yourself. This story, if we can call it that, has the pacing of a filing cabinet. It opens slowly and mostly contains paper. The suit is the first detail that behaves like a puzzle without acting like one. It's neat. It's a little too neat. The labels have been cut out, which is either a deliberate decision or just the gentle violence of tailoring, because tailors remove labels too, sometimes, and not every act is a message. Still, when you want answers, you start treating everything like a hint. The tie knot is tidy. The cuffs are clean. The pockets contain small, ordinary items that feel almost insulting in their normality. A comb, a bus ticket, things that suggest a day that was supposed to continue. The comb is a comb, and yet it becomes a character. People talk about its type, its quality, whether it fits the style of the man's hair, as if a comb can testify in court. It cannot. It can only be a comb, patiently waiting while humans build theories around its very quiet teeth. The more the investigators look, the more the suit becomes a kind of checklist. Not a glamorous checklist. The boring kind. The kind that makes you grateful for pens. They note the missing hat. They note the missing wallet. They note the small, frustrating absence of a name. No identifying papers, no friendly card, no address tucked into a fold. There is, instead, the feeling of someone who arrived with care and left without leaving behind anything convenient. And then, in one of those moments where history flirts with literature, they find a scrap of paper rolled up small, hiding in a pocket like a secret that wants to be found but doesn't want to be seen. It says Temum Shud, or some spelling close enough to be recognized by someone with the right memory of foreign words. Persian for "it is finished," 2 words that sound as final as a door clicking shut. The phrase doesn't scream, it just sits there. It has the calm confidence of a rubber stamp. Police place it under glass, newspapers repeat it. People who have never cared about Persian poetry suddenly learn how to pronounce 2 syllables, and they do it with a solemn enthusiasm normally reserved for crossword answers. Breathe in 4, out 6, and let the words be what they are, an ending that introduces itself before anything else has properly begun. Once a phrase exists, a source must exist too. That's how minds work. A scrap torn from somewhere implies a missing somewhere. And so the quiet machinery of investigation turns. Bookshops, libraries, secondhand stalls, shelves with soft dust. Eventually, a battered copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam enters the case. Not with a flourish, but with the weary practicality of an object that has been handled too much. It's found in a car, which is exactly the kind of detail that sounds exciting until you remember cars are mostly where people lose things. Receipts, buttons, old mints, the will to clean under the seats. The book's last page is missing in just the right way. The torn edge fits the scrap like a healed bone fits its old break. There is a small satisfaction in that fit, an almost cozy sense of at least one thing aligns. And it is a dangerous kind of comfort because it makes you want everything else to align too. The back cover carries faint pencil marks. Not a dramatic manifesto, not a confession. Just lines and letters, grouped strangely, like someone was making notes and then decided the notes didn't need to be readable by anyone else. It's the kind of writing that, if found in the margin of a cookbook, would mean nothing. Here, it becomes a language. People copy it out carefully, as if copying more neatly might make it clearer. They tally the letters. They look for patterns. They squint at spacing the way you squint at a stain and decide it resembles a continent. The city begins to live with the idea that the book is a room with one vanished wall, and everyone keeps walking into the wall politely, hoping it will turn into a door. There's also a phone number because real life loves to put the most mundane details right next to the most mysterious ones. A number sits there like a doorbell no one wants to press too hard. It leads eventually to a nurse and to a conversation that becomes famously careful. She says little. She remembers less. She closes the window on the whole thing with a quiet, practiced motion. That is another strange truth of historical puzzles. The people closest to them often behave like people tired, private, unwilling to become public property. The record keeps verbs called, visited, denied while nouns then out where privacy begins. And the city, again, learns the slow discipline of not knowing. Meanwhile, the pencil code becomes a hobby. Not for everyone, of course, for a special kind of person. The kind who enjoys alphabets and the small thrill of an organized grid. Cryptographers and hobbyists circle the groups of letters, trying on ideas like coats, acrostic, root cipher, initialism, diary shorthand. Each method fits for a moment, then slips at the shoulders. An X might be a kiss, it might be a crossroad. It might be nothing at all, the way people sometimes draw X's when they read bored or when a pencil needs to be tested. One line through a line might mean cancel this, or it might just mean the writer's hand moved the way it always moved. Meaning approaches, tests the handle, and walks past without coming in. What makes the whole thing strangely sleepy, in spite of its reputation, is how much of it is administration. People imagine investigations as quick flashes and decisive gestures. In reality, much of it is filing. It is waiting for lab results. It is reading reports written by someone who is trying to be accurate and also wants to go home. It is the careful language of possibility, may have, appears, could suggest. Even the poetic phrase Timon Shud sits there like an official stamp, because once it enters the file, it becomes part of the file. Mystery is, in practice, a stack of documents held together by a clip. And then there's the suitcase, which is less poetic and more stubbornly physical. A case at a station. A locker. A false name. Inside, shirts, thread, small tools. Things that suggest travel and work without committing to a specific job. Orange thread of all things becomes notable. Not because orange is rare, but because it's specific enough to feel personal. Tailor's marks appear, stencils, a shaving kit. All the little rituals of someone maintaining a presentable surface. The scissors, as someone once remarked, took their answers days ago. A suitcase can hold your life for a weekend, and then, if left behind, it can become an exhibit of your habits. You fold this way, you mend that way, you prefer this kind of soap, and still none of it says your name out loud. Witness statements drift in with their own soft limitations. A man seen here, a face that could be many faces, a posture that suggests nothing dramatic. People recall what they can, and what they can recall is usually shape and mood rather than certainty. The records become a slow, foggy map. The tracks go straight as rails and then fade in the distance, like memory itself. The nurse's phone rings in that quiet street, and the moment becomes part of the story simply because it exists at all. A number in a back cover turns into a path, and then the path stops, as paths often do, at a closed door. Over time, the case develops a second life as an object of curiosity, not just for officials, but for the kind of people who collect puzzles the way others collect stamps. They read old articles, they compare photographs, they argue gently about editions of the Rubaiyat, because of course they do. The Rubaiyat itself becomes a strange symbol in all this, a book about time and endings and the small absurdity of certainty. It's almost too on the nose, and that's precisely why it feels unreal. History sometimes does that. It places a dramatic prop in the middle of an otherwise very ordinary room, and everyone thinks the prop must be the point. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a book that happened to be nearby. What's consistent across all the decades of attention is that the best-known parts of the case are still the quietest parts. The cut labels, the small scrap, the pencil marks, the waiting suitcase, the phone number that leads not to revelation, but to a polite refusal to become entangled. There is no chase scene. There is no triumphant reveal. There is, instead, the city learning how to carry a question without dropping it, like a cup of tea you want to keep warm. And that might be the most boring, comforting truth here. Most mysteries do not resolve. They soften. They become familiar. People stop expecting an ending and start treating the question as furniture. It remains in the room. You dust it occasionally. You move it slightly when you rearrange your interests. It shows up again at odd hours when you can't sleep, and you find yourself thinking about pencil marks on paper from long ago, and you wonder briefly, calmly, what kind of person writes like that, and why. You can imagine the case file itself thickening through the years, inquest notes cooling into folders, photographs fading a little at the edges, new tests added like margin notes, each one careful not to disturb the main text too much. The code changes hands, the book changes owners. The story changes decades without tiring. Some mysteries close with a bang. This one closes like a book you keep finding open face down on the same page. So, if you'd like, we can end the way the file seems to prefer, not with an answer, but with a small ritual. Keep facts in one jar scrap, book, code, case. Keep stories in another labeled lightly, open rarely, because stories expand when they're given too much air. Add one check tomorrow, erase one flourish tonight. Let the tide wash rumor off the stones, just for a while. If meeting knocks, ask for receipts. If silence answers, let it. The surf keeps breathing against the low wall. A tram bell thins into dusk. Somewhere, a matchbox shuts with a quiet little verdict. And the page that vanished stays vanished, not as a threat, not as a cliffhanger, but as a soft gap the mind can rest inside, the way it rests inside unanswered questions when it finally decides to sleep. You might not expect a mystery to survive mostly by being filed correctly, but that is often how these things keep breathing. Not with footsteps in alleys, not with dramatic last words, but with stapled pages, carbon copies, and the gentle persistence of someone in an office deciding that a detail is worth keeping. The Somerton man in the end becomes less of a person and more of a habit. The habit of returning to a folder, lifting a photograph from its sleeve and saying very quietly, still nothing, as if nothing were a thing you can measure and sign. If you're still awake right now, you can subscribe if you'd like, or you can simply drift past that idea the way a wave drifts past a rock. Either way is fine. The case itself never seems to mind whether anyone is watching. It just sits there, patient, like a book left open on a table in a room that has gone dark. After the first shock fades, and shock is generous here, because most shocks are brief, and this one was long and administrative, the city learns to live with the question, the way it learns to live with salt air. There are inquest notes, and there is the dull comfort of official language. Male, unknown, found at, followed by the sort of precise description that never quite becomes real in the mind. Lists appear. Lists always appear: clothing, contents, measurements, times. Someone writes down the condition of a tie the way you might write down the condition of a window latch. Someone else checks that writing and adds their own, because history is often just people double-checking one another's handwriting. The objects begin their quiet careers as objects with importance. The comb, the bus ticket, the cut labels, the scrap of Tamam Shud, and that battered book with its wounded last page. None of them change, which is precisely why people keep returning to them. Humans like stable things. A mystery is unstable, but a scrap of paper is reliable. It stays a scrap. It stays folded. It stays stubbornly unable to explain itself. And that steadiness is oddly soothing, like staring at a clock you don't need, just to watch it behave. In the background, the world changes in ways the case can't quite keep up with. Methods evolve. The confidence of certain tests rises and falls like fashion. There are decades when people are sure the answer must be in the pencil code, because codes feel like doors you can open with the right key. There are decades when people are sure the answer must be in a name, because names feel like the most human kind of evidence. And there are decades when people decide the answer must be in the objects again, because the objects are still there when theories get tired and go home. Every so often, a new person arrives with fresh energy, which is a sweet thing to witness from a distance. They look at the photographs and see something everyone else missed, or they think they do. They read old reports and notice the strange calm of them. They feel the same small private thrill that comes from finding a footnote no one asked for. They might write an article. They might write a letter. They might simply tell a friend late at night that the code could be a shorthand, or a habit, or a kind of personal accounting that only made sense to its writer. Then, as time does, time smooths their certainty down. The case trains people into gentleness. It is very hard to stay loudly confident around an old file that refuses to yield. And still, the case accumulates quiet mythology. Not the kind with dragons, but the kind with office furniture. People imagine a detective leaning back in a chair, rubbing tired eyes, staring at the same lines of letters for the 100th time. They imagine the nurse receiving a call and deciding very reasonably that she would like to be left alone. They imagine small conversations that never made it into reports. Someone saying, "It might be nothing," and someone else replying, "Yes, but we have to write it down anyway, because that is what you do when you are the sort of person who is paid to not ignore small things." The pencil code, in particular, becomes the kind of puzzle that attracts a certain gentle obsession. It's not that people want a dramatic answer. It's that the code looks like it should be solvable, and should is a very persuasive word. Patterns are suggested, patterns are rejected. Someone proposes that the letters are initials for a poem or a list, or a set of instructions as practical as buy milk, except written in a private shorthand so no one else will tease you for forgetting. Someone else proposes it's a route, a map, a set of turns. And then, very softly, the code remains exactly what it has always been. Pencil marks on a book's back cover, resting where a thumb might have held the paper steady. What the city ends up holding, more than any one theory, is the feeling of an unfinished file. There is a particular kind of unfinished that becomes familiar and almost domestic. The way the plate in the sink becomes part of the kitchen if you leave it long enough. The way the unanswered email becomes part of your day, not because it's urgent, but because it exists. The Somerton man becomes part of Adelaide's background noise, and not the loud kind, a quiet kind. The kind that makes you strangely calm, because you are no longer expecting the room to suddenly change. And then comes the practical afterlife of evidence. Objects don't like attention, but attention finds them anyway. A suit becomes a relic. A suitcase becomes a story. A scrap of paper becomes a symbol. One of the gentlest ironies of the whole case is that the phrase, "it is finished," becomes a kind of perpetual beginning. People repeat it because it sounds final, and in repeating it, they keep the file open. The phrase is like a bookmark that refuses to let the book close properly. The passage of time adds its own slow comedy. For a while, the mystery is contemporary, and everyone involved is simply trying to do their job. Later, it becomes historical, and people begin to speak about it with that solemn tone we reserve for the past, as if the past is always dignified. But much of this past is ordinary. It smells like paper and dust and sea air. It sounds like a telephone ringing in a quiet street, then not leading anywhere useful. It looks like a man's shoes that were polished for reasons no one can now ask about. It's hard to make that glamorous, and honestly, that is part of its charm. It is a mystery made of small things. In the years that follow, small changes keep arriving. A new article appears, a photograph is reprinted. Someone rereads the old witness statements and notices how slippery memory is when it tries to be helpful. Someone remarks, dryly, that if the man had simply carried a business card, half the case would have evaporated. Another person points out, equally dryly, that business cards are easy to lose and life is not obligated to be convenient. The file continues. The city continues. The sea continues doing the only thing it ever promised to do, coming in, going out, leaving the beach neither solved nor impressed. At some point quietly, without any need for fanfare, the case becomes less about who and more about how people behave around not knowing. That's almost always the real story if you sit with it long enough. The detectives behave with routine. The public behaves with curiosity. The newspapers behave with bursts of certainty followed by softer, smaller corrections. Hobbyists behave with hopeful patience. Skeptics behave with a kind of protective shrug. Everyone builds a little mental shelf for the case and sets it there beside other unsolved things, and occasionally dusts it with a new thought. And now, gently, we drift into the part where the city learns to keep the question without turning it into a performance. The inquiries cool into archives. The files age into something sturdier than a headline. The mystery becomes, in a strange way, a lesson in restraint. Not just restraint in what you claim, but restraint in what you expect. A person can disappear into the world, and the world can continue. That is not dramatic. It is simply true, and truths like that are often the most quietly exhausting. There's a soft, almost sleepy dignity in the way records refuse to pretend. They do not fill in blanks with imagination. They leave blanks as blanks. The best notes are careful and a little boring. The best notes say unknown and mean it. They say possibly and mean we do not want to lie just to sound confident. They are the opposite of a plot twist. They are instead the slow art of not making a mess with your certainty, so the city keeps the code. It keeps the page that vanished. It keeps the suitcase that waited. It keeps the rumor at a respectful distance, at least in the best versions of this story. And it keeps doing the small rituals that are, in their own way, a kind of lullaby, checking a detail, relabeling a photograph, measuring a claim against the paper it came from. The work is repetitive. The work is calm. The work, if you think about it, is exactly the kind of work that makes a person sleepy because it is careful and methodical and never in a hurry. And maybe that's the best way to let this episode rest. Not with a conclusion, not with a bright answer, but with the kind of bedtime oath a librarian might mutter to the shelves when the lights go down. Keep facts in one jar. The scrap, the book, the pencil code, the suit, the case number written in someone's tidy hand. Keep stories in another jar, labeled lightly, open rarely, because stories swell when you stare at them too hard. Tomorrow, if you feel like it, you can check one detail and put it back. You can let one theory fade the way a wave erases a footprint. You can remember that not knowing is not always a failure. Sometimes it is simply a quiet shape the mind can rest inside. The surf keeps breathing against the low wall. The tram bell keeps spinning into the evening, as if it's already getting tired of being heard. A matchbox closes somewhere with a small, tidy click. The book remains a book. The code remains pencil, and the page remains missing, and missing things, when the night is calm, can feel less like a threat and more like a soft gap in the sentence, an empty space where your thoughts can slow down, loosen their grip, and finally, very gently, stop trying to solve anything at all